Three, two, one. Hey guys, welcome back to the Foam Frat Podcast.
All right.
So the dust has settled on conference season. We are finally getting back in the studio, and we're getting down to work on some of this F5 content. Sam, I think if we put all the places that we have both visited within the last 30 days all together, it would be ridiculous. You've been to, let's see, where do we start off? We started off at Memphis.
Yeah, Hospital Wing had us down. We had a great time there. They took us out for some barbecue. We gave a few talks at their conference. They had an awesome venue down there as well. We had a lot of fun. And then I think right after that, so we went down to Memphis. We had a real time getting back to Wisconsin. I think we both had 2 or 3 canceled and delayed planes, missed connections.
It was going back and forth too, because my plane got delayed and Sam's like, "See you later, sucker." And then he leaves, and what happened? Something happened with the there was an emergency landing, right? You just did a big circle.
We had an emergency. Yeah, so we went I was connecting from Memphis over to North Carolina. North Carolina was taking me up to Milwaukee, and we were at cruising altitude, and all of a sudden the flight attendant comes over the radio, and she's like, "I want everybody's tray tables up and locked in the upright position, and put your seats up and all this stuff." She's like, "We're going to be on the ground in less than 10 minutes." She said she just got word from the pilot, and we just started going down quick, and we heard nothing from the pilot for 5 minutes. He must have been talking to air traffic control or something. And he came over and said that they're getting messages that the engines were overheating and that we were landing in Knoxville. So I went from Memphis to North Carolina to Charlotte, and then back to Knoxville, where I got stuck for quite some time. And then finally they sent a new plane to bring us back up to Milwaukee. So I don't even know which one of us ended up getting home first. You spent the night in
Yeah, Dallas, Fort Worth. Yeah, I spent the night out there, so that was fun. But
so I still won.
We had a good time though, and Hospital Wing was fantastic. A bunch of nice guys, and they're getting ultrasound and they're getting whole blood. A lot of good stuff going on there. And then we went to New Orleans after that, and we did EMS World. And then right after New Orleans, EMS World, you went and taught a ventilator class with Eric in, where was that, Cincinnati?
Yeah, we were down in Ohio with ProMedica. That was a really great class. We had 3 days of classes back to back to back, and they got some great clinicians over there. We really enjoyed our time.
And then you came back for 2 days, and then you flew out to Colorado for ACEP?
Yeah, ACEP. I was out there with SCORE and got to spend some time. We went to one restaurant one night. We had a rattlesnake appetizer. I had buffalo soup, and then elk and quail for my main course. So I had 4 meats that I had never had before, right in a row. They got some awesome stuff out there.
Then I went to Alabama for their EMS conference, and that was great. And then we both we met back up for WEMSA. So we've been everywhere. It's been a lot of fun. It's been neat seeing all these new friends that we have from the podcast that listen and come up and introduce themselves to us. That's always really cool to see that. So we are going to talk about Supraglottic Airways today, and I was going to do an entire podcast on it, but I already made an entire video talking about Supraglottic Airways for the Foam Frat Paramedic refresher. And so what I thought we'd do is just do a quick little introduction, and then I'm just going to roll those films. But what I wanted to see, Sam, is you jumping in the back of an ambulance, maybe you're doing an intercept. What typically has made you say yay or nay on keeping a supraglottic airway in?
Mostly, is the patient oxygenating and are they ventilating? And if both of those things are good, placement on the supraglottic looks good. It's an iffy decision. You made a great point in the video that nobody goes to the ICU with a supraglottic airway in, and that's true. But when we're handling the resuscitation out in the field, that's a very that's an important decision to make, to say, okay, I have something that's oxygenating and ventilating right now. The placement looks good. Should I pull this out and put a definitive airway in? Is this the time for this? So I would say those are my 2 main things.
Yeah, so I just took a decision tree and I mapped out kind of the thought process. So it really is all based off of if you see the end tidal CO2 waveform or not. So you jump in the back, you look at the monitor, do they have a good end tidal CO2 tracing? And if they don't, then you do 2 corrective steps. You try to maybe pull back on the king airway a little bit, if it's the king, or if it is the I-gel, make sure it's adjusted in there well. You get one chance at that, and then you consider suctioning, because you could have some mucus or some yucky crap from the intubation stuck up inside that, and it's preventing it from picking up a tracing. And if you do both of those, which take a couple seconds to do, and you still don't have a good tracing, then you got to pull it out, and you got to start ventilating them with a bag valve mask until you can either put another supraglottic airway in, figure out or troubleshoot that one, or just go ahead and intubate them. And so that's down that side, the ventilation side. And then over on the oxygenation side, you want to make sure that the number that you're seeing, so let's just say you jump in, you see 76%. You want to make sure that you have a good pleth wave. And you're going to see in this video, I say SpO2 stands for see the pleth before O2. That doesn't mean see the pleth before you give O2, but before you take the O2 saturation on the monitor serious. So you want to make sure you have a good pleth wave. Because if you have your blood pressure cuff on that arm and it's in the middle of a cycle, and you have no pleth wave at all, then obviously you can't trust that. But if you do have a good pleth wave and you're not oxygenating well, you really got to step back and say, why am I not oxygenating well? What would change if I had an ET tube inside the trachea? And typically, the only thing that the ET tube lets you do is increase higher amounts of PEEP. Now, the King airway, in my experience, can tolerate pretty good PEEP. I can get it up to 10. I think the highest I've ever had a King is up to 12 or 13. But the I-gel just likes to pop out. It likes to displace when you start increasing PEEP. Has that been your experience as well?
I haven't had the I-gel under very much PEEP, but I did visit the intersurgical booth when we were at, I believe it was EMS World, and they did show me a different way of securing it. So let me ask, when you're securing it, are you putting, for instance, when the strap comes up behind the neck, does the right strap go on the right side and the left strap go on the left side, or are you crisscrossing them?
No. So prior to us getting the new Thomas tube holders, one would go on the right side and one would go on the left side, and they would lock into those little notches there. Now we use it's a Thomas tube holder, but it's got a wider profile so it can fit the I-gel in there. And I'll be honest, those we just put those on the ship, and I haven't had much experience with those yet. But up to that point, we were using the straps on the I-gel, and one would go on the right and one would go on the left. It would not crisscross.
So at the booth, they did show me that they crisscross theirs, and I don't know if that's what they actually recommend for that product, but when they demoed it at their booth, because we did talk about that, the PEEP and the peak pressures and things like that, they did mention crisscrossing those straps. So I don't know if that makes much of a difference. You'd think tight was tight either way, but there may be some difference in crisscrossing the straps.
But yeah, so if you're increasing the PEEP and you notice on your ventilator your leak is going up, and I know on the T1 it'll say V leak and you get a percentage, and if you start seeing that go up higher, then it could start to compromise your ventilation. And so you got to think about, is this PEEP that's required going to cause me to run into some problems when it comes to my minute ventilation? And if it is, it may be a time to pull that out and actually put in an endotracheal tube. And this is all just, I'd say expert opinion, but I'm not an expert. This is all just opinion based off of working with these, that this may be something that you need to consider. I don't know if you have a patient that's at 76% or 80% and you're increasing your PEEP. Part of me wonders if pulling that supraglottic airway out at that point is a good idea or a bad idea, because if I pull that out, then I'm going to lose whatever recruitment I had, and now I got to use a BVM and try to get them up a little bit higher before I would actually intubate them. And so you run into the situation to now you're intubating a hypoxic patient.
Yeah, that can be a difficult situation to be in because if you feel like your supraglottic isn't getting where you want to go with the levels of PEEP that you're able to use, uh, there's some other questions that you would want to ask, like, do I need to suction that supraglottic airway? Is there some vomit, airway contaminant sitting in the cuff of it, sitting in the glottic opening that I need to try to suction this patient? Would that improve oxygenation? Did I notice that the mouth was full of stuff and I didn't suction before I put that in or wasn't able to, and now that's in the airway? In that case, maybe pulling it and suctioning what you can and putting an endotracheal tube in might be a plausible option, but I see what you're saying. They're kind of far down on the oxyhemoglobin desaturation curve, and when you pull that out, you have to be ready to oxygenate them to the best of your ability because they're not starting at a very level place on that curve.
Because if I'm ventilating them, the only reason I wouldn't be oxygenating them is if there was a significant VQ mismatch. Would you agree with that?
Yep, and it could be on either side. So if that was a patient who wasn't oxygenating well in the first place, that could be on the creation of dead space side, or it could be, if you're dealing with a lung patient, that could definitely be on the pulmonary shunt side as well.
Yeah, so I'd have to really debate whether, if I'm at like 90%, 91%, and I got a patient that's got a significant VQ mismatch and they got a shunt, whether that be something like pneumonia or ARDS, whether it's really even worth pulling it out at that point and maybe just do those corrective steps of suctioning, making sure it's seated right. But as long as I got a good end-tidal CO2 tracing, that's really the main thing I'm looking at. And then the oxygenation, who is it? Vahe Ender said, nobody ever died from a bee. So if you can get them to at least 90% and they are a super sick lung patient, I'm probably okay with that because I don't know if pulling that and trying to intubate is the right move there. All right. Well, we should roll the clip then, and we'll roll the videos. You guys can watch it. Like I said, this is from the Foam Frat Paramedic Refresher. And we are going to start our live classes, the F5 instructor-led classes, on January 6th. They're going to run Monday through Friday. We got 2 sessions a day for January and February, and then March, we're just going to go crazy. We're going to have tons of sessions. That way everybody can get all the live hours they want. And Adam LaChapelle and Jared Patterson, 2, I would say recent graduates, but they were like in the first Prolific Speakers Atlas course we did. They are going to be helping us as our 2 adjunct instructors, so I'm pretty excited about that. All right, enough of that. Let's roll the video.
Yeah, let's roll the clips.
The decision to take out a supraglottic airway requires a little bit more bandwidth than the decision to put one in. And there may be a tendency when you walk in and you see a patient has an iGel or an LTD to want to just take it out and put in a definitive airway. But in reality, if the patient is oxygenating and they're ventilating appropriately, we really need to have a systematic approach on when to take out a supraglottic airway. And so I attempted to do this in a flowchart. And what I did was made an initial copy of the flowchart, and then I had a bunch of revisions. I sent it out to people I know, and they said, hey, you should add this or you should add that. And this is what we finally came up with. And so that's what I want to talk about for a couple minutes, is how to decide when you should pull out the supraglottic airway. And we're going to do this in 2 scenarios. Now, scenario 1, you're intercepting with a BLS crew. They have placed a King LTD. Now, I like to train my eyes what to look at immediately when I walk into the back of an ambulance. And so the first thing you're going to notice is that the patient is not spontaneously breathing. There may be a tendency to think that this is an ET tube, and then eventually you're going to realize that this is a supraglottic airway. Now, the next place I like to train my eyes to look is at the monitor. And I want to zero in on the CO2 waveform. If they don't have capnography hooked up, I want to hook that up immediately. And that is the first thing I want to see. And here you can visualize on this monitor, there is no waveform. And so I do not have end-tidal CO2. So once you visualize that you have no end-tidal CO2 waveform, you have 2 moves that you can do. You can attempt to suction, and then readjust the supraglottic airway. And so as far as suction goes, you can use a soft suction and try to pass that down the supraglottic airway. But if you meet some resistance or you have a lot of mucus, sometimes I'll actually take a bougie and push it down and maybe break up any mucus plugs that have formed within that supraglottic airway. Now, as far as readjusting goes, there is a couple things that happen on a regular basis, and they're kind of predictable, especially when you see a king LTD place. So here you can see that the king was inserted too far, and it's actually pushing the epiglottis upwards. And so that ventilation port, when it tries to ventilate the lungs, is going to meet some resistance, and this can have a diminishing end-tidal CO2 waveform. This can cause higher peak pressures, poor compliance with bagging them, and all you need to do is just pull it out just a little bit. And so if you notice that they're saying it's hard to bag or that your end-tidal CO2 waveform is diminished, just try pulling back a little bit while listening to lung sounds. You're going to find you get better ventilation, and you also get better capnography readings as well. All right, now if that does not work and you are still not getting a CO2 waveform, then it's time to just pull it out and bag them. And this is because if you're not ventilating a patient, you're not oxygenating the patient. And I think that's important, especially with a supraglottic airway. And that's why we talk about looking at the end-tidal CO2 value first. Because if you're exchanging gas, if you're getting CO2 back, then you are sending out oxygen. And whether that oxygen is able to diffuse to the alveoli and into the pulmonary circulation is a whole nother topic, but at least we know we are ventilating. All right, so let's look at scenario number 2. So you walk into a smaller tertiary facility that's going to be sending a patient out who came in with respiratory distress. They tell you they tried intubating multiple times, they failed, and so they put in an iGel. You see that the iGel's seated, it's secured, and your eyes immediately go to the monitor. You see that you have a good waveform, so you are exchanging gases, and then your eyes look at the SpO2. It says 70%. So you have a good end-tidal CO2 waveform. Now we're going to look at SpO2. Now, the SpO2 is obviously low here, and so what we want to do when that happens is we want to look at the pleth wave and make sure that we have a good pleth wave, and that's what it should look like. And there's a saying, see pleth before O2. That doesn't mean to see the pleth before you give O2. That means see the pleth before you take the oxygen saturation verbatim, before you take it as gospel. You want to make sure that they have good perfusion to those extremities. If they are in high doses of pressors, if they are in shock, that's going to be skewed, and so it's going to be hard, and it may not be worth removing an SGA just because they have poor perfusion when that is still ventilating appropriately. And so if you look at our flow chart here, you can say, yes, we have good pleth, and then you're going to move down here. Is the SpO2 greater than 90%? And if it is, well, then that's good. You keep it, you have no problem. If it's not, well, then we need to add some pressure. And so we do that by adding a PEEP valve. And so the PEEP valve is hopefully going to be in your bag, in your first in bag. We keep ours with our BVMs. And you can throw the PEEP valve to whoever's performing the ventilation to the patient with the BVM, pop it on, and hopefully that will start to increase the SpO2. You're recruiting more area and you're applying pressure above the oxygen. You're utilizing Henry's law. But one of the problems that can occur is when you start to use PEEP and you start increasing it, as you build up the pressure right here, it can cause the supraglottic airway to displace, and that's because you're creating pressure. That can lead to gastric insufflation, it can create air leaks, and it can make a transport miserable on a ventilator. And so there's not a whole lot of literature out there. There's a couple studies looking at the iGel, but they only went up to 5 of PEEP. So we know that if we're using a PEEP of 5 with an iGel, that we're probably good. But if we require escalating PEEP, if we have to go up to 10 or 15 because the patient has a significant VQ mismatch, well, then we need to ask ourselves, is the required PEEP causing an air leak? And if it is, you can trace that on the flow chart. And so we can see that the required PEEP is causing an air leak. And so we probably should consider a definitive airway. All right, so there you have it. That's the flow chart. Do I have a good end-tidal CO2 waveform? Train your eyes to look at the monitor and look for that waveform. No? Well, attempt to suction and readjust once. If it's the King LTD, you're going to pull it back just a little bit, knowing that you may have kicked up the epiglottis when they put it in too deep and it's causing an obstructed airway. All right, after that, do I have a good end-tidal CO2 waveform? No? All right, pull it out. You're going to ventilate with a BVM and OPA. Now, if you do have a good end-tidal CO2 waveform, you're going to look at the pleth wave. Does the pleth wave look good? No? All right, well, let's check perfusion. If their blood pressure's in the toilet, then that's probably why. And let's check the probe placement. Lots of times you have the probe placed on a finger that is also getting a blood pressure taken on it. That's no bueno. All right, if that's good, you have a good pleth wave, well, then you're going to say, is my SpO2 above 90%? If it is, yes, that's a keeper. Now, what you don't see in here is you should still apply a PEEP valve, but anything higher than 5 is probably going to create an air leak. We don't have enough literature showing that you can go much beyond that without it possibly becoming displaced. All right, if it's not above 90%, then you add the PEEP valve still, and you can escalate the PEEP. But if the escalation in PEEP is causing an air leak, well, then you may need to consider a definitive airway. That's my systematic approach on when to pull out a supraglottic airway. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions, put them in the comment box below.